At the farthest edge of Marion County lies a place the surveyors called Deadwater Settlement, not for any river, but for the stagnant cistern at its center, where the surface grows a pale, skin-like film each summer. No roads reach it now. The last path was swallowed by briars decades ago, and the single remaining milepost leans half-buried in the clay. The air smells faintly of rust and boiled wool, and on certain mornings, the fog moves as if remembering where it came from. Here, for 6 unbroken generations, one family lived and married only among themselves. The houses, 3 long, low frames with roofs like broken spines, stand in a rough triangle around the cistern. No outsiders settled here, and no records survive, except the names scratched into the backs of cupboard doors. And in the middle of this, I'll ask you something I always do. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Remember that moment, because it will follow you through the rest of this story. They say the water in that cistern never ripples, even when touched. The family learned to draw from it quietly, as though disturbing its skin might wake whatever sleeps below. The Whitlock bloodline began folding in on itself long before the place was called Deadwater. The earliest mention comes from an 1870s coroner's ledger, where a drowning victim was described as a man whose face suggested kinship to himself. That cryptic remark would later seem less poetic and more precise. Marriage licenses, when they were filed at all, linked cousin to cousin in loops so tight they nearly overlapped. Children born of these unions carried not just the family name, but the same narrowing features: eyes a little too close, skin with a sallow undertone like parchment left in smoke. Yet the family treated these likenesses as proof of purity, a mark that their blood had never been watered by strangers. Outsiders were rare in Deadwater, and when they arrived, they did not stay. The few who ventured close spoke of a silence that seemed to press against the ears. Even the birds avoided the cistern clearing. Doors sagged from their hinges, but were never mended, as though nothing here required improvement. What was, always had been. The deeper the roots dug, the more tangled they became, until bloodlines were no longer lines at all, but a knot no outsider could hope to unravel. By the turn of the century, Deadwater had withdrawn completely from the surrounding county. Mail came only twice a month, carried by a postman who never dismounted his horse. He claimed the ground felt wrong underfoot, as if the soil had been strained through something unclean. The family accepted his deliveries in silence, taking the parcels with hands that bore the same oddly flattened nails. Inside their homes, the air was thick with the smell of damp timber and boiled root vegetables. Furniture was hand-built and passed down, worn smooth, not by polish, but by the slow erosion of generations. The same beds were slept in by fathers and their sons. The same chairs creaked under countless shared names. They spoke in a dialect that bent common words into strange shapes, a private code outsiders couldn't pass. It wasn't just accent, it was possession of language, shaped over decades, with no influence beyond their blood walls. And through it all, the cistern remained the still heart of Deadwater. Children were taught never to look too long into its surface, for in the dark reflection, it was said, you might see not yourself, but the same face, staring back across 100 years. When winter came to Deadwater, it did not arrive like in other places. Snow rarely touched the ground here. Instead, the cold crept in as a heavy damp, clinging to clothes and skin, until it felt sewn into the body. Chimneys exhaled in thin, reluctant ribbons, as though the fires inside were shy about revealing themselves. In these months, the family kept closer than ever. Doors were latched from the inside, and windows already cloudy with age were layered with waxed cloth to keep out the chill. Meals were communal, taken in the largest of the 3 houses, where a table built from a single felled oak had held every generation's elbows. Stories were told in low voices, more ritual than entertainment. They spoke of births and deaths in the same breath, marking the passage of life as though it were all part of a single, unbroken event. Laughter was rare, and when it came, it carried a nervous edge, dying quickly in the rafters. Outside, the cistern gathered ice, but never fully froze. The surface shimmered faintly, even in darkness, like something alive turning beneath. They avoided it in winter, not for fear of falling in, but for fear of what might come out. By spring, the thaw revealed more than just mud. The sodden ground would sometimes give up relics of the family's past, rusted buttons, fragments of porcelain dolls, or bones so small they might have belonged to birds, though no one in Deadwater kept fowl. These finds were gathered quietly and placed in a cedar box in the attic of the eldest home, never spoken of again. Spring was also the season of unions. The marriages were brief affairs, conducted in the narrow parlour beneath a framed needlepoint that read, "Ours alone." There was no music, no feasting, just the quiet exchange of vows, before the same two witnesses, year after year. In Deadwater, the concept of choice had eroded long before memory began. Children born in these months were baptized, not in the county church, but at the cistern. Water was drawn in a brass pail, poured over the infant's head, while the elders stood in a ring, their eyes fixed on the surface as though waiting for a sign, and always, the water remained calm, accepting whatever it was given. Some whispered that the cistern had been drinking from them, just as they had from it, for generations beyond counting. Summer in Deadwater carried a heat that did not feel natural. The air was heavy, almost syrup thick, and the shade under the black pines offered no relief. Flies moved slow, as if even their wings struggled to push through the weight of it. In this season, the family kept to the interiors, shutters drawn against the glaring sun. It was during summer that tempers tended to fray. Cousins who had been raised side by side sometimes drifted into strange alliances, whispered conversations lingering too long in unlit corners. Disagreements never escalated into open violence, but the quiet in those moments was sharper, like the house itself was holding its breath. The cistern, too, seemed altered in summer, its water darkened to an inky black, no matter how bright the sky above. At night, a faint ripple would spread across the surface. Though there was no wind, elders warned children not to wander after dusk. They spoke of shapes glimpsed at the edge of the clearing, tall, unmoving figures that vanished if you tried to look directly at them. Whether spirit, memory, or something born of the blood itself, no one would say, but the warning was obeyed, always. Autumn in Deadwater was the only season that carried colour, though even that seemed muted, leaves turning not bright gold or crimson, but to shades of ochre, rust, and a bruised, purplish brown. The air carried the smell of wet leaves and something metallic, as though the forest itself were bleeding into the soil. It was the season of preparation. Root cellars were filled, water barrels cleaned, and wood cut into neat stacks behind each home. The work was done without chatter, each task performed with the same deliberate pace that had been taught for generations. Autumn also brought the annual gathering, all living members of the bloodline meeting at the largest house. There, under the dim light of oil lamps, the elders would recite the names of every family member who had lived, married, and died in Deadwater. It was not a memorial. It was a reminder. On these nights, the cistern was left uncovered, its surface reflecting the cold moon. Some swore they saw faces there, not the dead, but the living, as they might look decades from now. Whether blessing or curse, no one could agree, but no one turned away. By the final weeks before winter, Deadwater seemed to draw inward, as though the very ground anticipated what was coming. Paths between the three houses became little more than tracks through damp leaves, and the forest's edge seemed to press closer, branches knotting overhead, like fingers laced in secrecy. It was during these weeks that births most often occurred. The rooms were kept dim, shutters barred, and only a handful of relatives allowed inside. Newborn cries were brief. The family had a way of quieting them quickly, as though the sound might draw something from outside. After each birth, the mother was given a cup of water from the cistern. The liquid was dark and tasted faintly of iron, yet it was swallowed without hesitation. The same water would be used to wash the newborn's skin, a ritual older than any written record. By the time the frost returned, the cycle was complete. Marriages, births, and the silent tending of the family's own bloodline. Deadwater did not change with the years. It simply repeated itself, as though bound by something deeper than tradition, something no one dared name aloud. The first recorded whisper of Deadwater's true nature came not from an official census or family ledger, but from the notebook of a travelling surveyor who had ventured too far from the main road. His entry, smudged and uneven from damp fingers, described the place as an unmapped hollow of repeating faces. He had meant it as a geographical note, that every person he saw bore some resemblance to the last, yet it became an unintentional summary of the family's entire history. Deadwater's isolation was both deliberate and circumstantial. The land was hemmed in by marshes that shifted with the seasons, swallowing paths and spitting up new ones with no warning. Outsiders rarely came twice, and those who did found the place unchanged, as if their absence had been a mere blink. This geographical cocoon made cousin marriages inevitable, then ritual, and finally rule. The origins of the custom were shrouded in stories that could not be separated from superstition. Some claimed it began during a fever outbreak, when the elders decreed no one was to marry beyond the blood until the sickness passed. Others whispered of a land claim forged through marriage bonds, ensuring no outside heirs could challenge it. Whatever its start, the practice endured, not as necessity, but as law. In the early years, the effects were invisible to an untrained eye. Children were born healthy, strong enough to endure the labor-heavy life of the hollow. But over time, small anomalies began to appear. A boy whose eyes did not track together, a girl whose voice never rose above a whisper, hands with extra knuckles, knees that bent in ways they should not. These were not seen as defects, but as marks of belonging. The elders carried an unshakable belief that the bloodline was a vessel for something sacred. They spoke of keeping the water pure, a phrase that to an outsider might have referred to the murky cistern, but to the family meant their own lineage. The cistern itself became entwined with this belief, its water used in every rite of passage. It was not merely symbolic. Those who refused the ritual drink were said to have fallen ill or disappeared entirely within a season. An itinerant preacher once tried to challenge the practice. He arrived with a leather-bound Bible and a voice trained to carry across fields. At first the family listened, polite in their stillness, but when he spoke against the marrying of one's own, the air seemed to thicken. By the next morning, he was gone, his camp abandoned, his tracks leading into the marsh until they simply stopped. Over the decades, the outside world advanced. Railways carved through hills, towns grew into cities, but Deadwater remained as it had always been. Its children learned the same lessons, its adults kept the same vows, and its elders guarded the same secrets. To them, change was not progress. It was contamination. In the family's private records, a set of cloth-bound books kept in a locked cabinet, marriages were charted with meticulous precision. Each page bore two names, connected by a line that curved inward, never outward. From one generation to the next, the lines folded tighter, like a noose slowly cinching. Yet there was no sign of doubt in these pages. The handwriting was steady, the ink dark and unfaded, as if the act of recording alone kept the bonds strong. Even when rumors of their peculiar customs seeped into nearby towns, they were dismissed as rural exaggerations. Outsiders who had glimpsed the family spoke of identical profiles, the same slope of brow, the same narrow set of the jaw, repeating in both men and women. But to the family, this sameness was not a cause for concern, it was proof of success. And in Deadwater, success meant only one thing: the cycle remained unbroken. The deeper one looks into Deadwater's lineage, the more the notion of time begins to blur. Generations did not pass in the way they did elsewhere. They folded into each other, each face echoing the last, until the difference between grandfather and grandson was often only in the silvering of hair. Names repeated just as faces did, further confounding any attempt by an outsider to map the family tree. A man could be speaking of Samuel and mean his cousin, his uncle, or a figure long buried, yet to him, there was no confusion. The marriages themselves were not the product of youthful desire, but of arrangement, agreed upon by the elders in shadowed rooms with shutters drawn tight. There was no ceremony beyond the exchange of water from the cistern, and a whispered vow that never left the lips of the betrothed. To wed outside was to betray not only the family, but the land itself, for they believed their survival was bound to the soil beneath their feet and the water that seeped through it. The effect of this insularity became a kind of unspoken language. Family members could interpret the smallest flicker of expression, the most minute shift in posture. Outsiders, if they chanced to visit, found this wordless communication unsettling, a silent undercurrent they could not follow. It was as if the family shared not only blood, but thought, a collective memory passed as effortlessly as breath. Those born into Deadwater rarely left, but when they did, they carried its mark. In nearby towns, whispers followed them, not always unkind, but always wary. They were recognized by their paleness, their light eyes with an odd glassy sheen, and their slow, deliberate speech. Some found work as laborers, or in mills, but they returned for marriages, births, and the funerals that ended not with burial, but with the lowering of the coffin into the black water of the cistern itself. Yes, the cistern was not merely symbolic, it was a tomb as much as it was a well. Those who had kept the water pure were given to it in death. Their coffins waited and slid into its depths without splash or ceremony. To outsiders, this would have been a grotesque act, but within Deadwater, it was the highest honor, the assurance that even in death, one's essence mingled with the family's source. Once, decades back, a doctor from a nearby city attempted to examine a child born with a twisted spine and translucent skin. His interest was framed as compassion, but his questions about the parents' relation were met with such a sudden unanimous silence that he knew he had trespassed into dangerous ground. By the next morning, he abandoned the case, citing uncooperative conditions in his official report. Privately, he told colleagues the place was more a living relic than a community, one where nature has been persuaded to turn inward on itself. Yet to the family, these so-called afflictions were nothing of the sort. They spoke instead of marks of the blood, traits they believed tethered them to an original purity that outsiders had long since lost. Every anomaly, every quirk of bone or skin, was regarded as a sign of favor from those who had come before. By the time the outside world began to truly encroach, roads carved closer, timber companies eyeing the forest, Deadwater had no intention of opening itself. The family did not negotiate, did not sell, and did not leave. It was as though they were waiting for the modern world to tire of trying, to recede like a tide that had pushed too far inland. And in truth, that is precisely what happened. For the rest of the country, the 20th century meant movement, invention and change. For Deadwater, it meant nothing at all. By the time winter reached its full grip, Deadwater's boundaries became almost impossible to breach. The forests thickened with frost, and the few narrow tracks in and out turned to ridged ice that cracked underfoot. Even those familiar with the land avoided it then, for the cold did not feel natural. It clung differently here, sharp and wet, as though the air itself carried the memory of the water that pooled beneath the frozen ground. It was in these months that the family's strangest gatherings occurred. They were not celebrations, but observances. Nights when the elders called every able-bodied member into the largest of the three houses. The windows were sealed, the lamps kept low, and bowls of the cistern water were placed at the center of the table. Each person, from the oldest to the youngest able to walk, would dip their fingers into the water and touch it to their lips. No one spoke during this act. No one ever explained its purpose. Afterward, the family sat in complete silence, save for the faint popping of the fire. At some unseen signal, the eldest, always a woman, would begin to speak. Her voice carried no story in the ordinary sense, but a list of names, spoken in a sequence that seemed meaningless to an outsider. Yet the family listened with utter attention, each name received like a tolling bell. The recitation lasted hours, sometimes until the fire burned down to embers. It was said that this list was longer each year, and that no name was ever removed. Even those who had left the family, those who had broken the unspoken laws, were called aloud. But the tone in which their names were spoken was colder, a faint tightening of the voice that marked their disfavor. When the recitation ended, the room would remain still for a long moment, before the eldest gave a single nod. Only then did anyone move, the gathering dispersing without further word. The water in the bowls was carried carefully back to the cistern, poured in as though returning something borrowed. The effect of these nights on the younger members was profound. Even those who could not yet understand the purpose of the ritual would mimic the gestures in play, their small fingers dipping obediently into the water. By the time they reached adolescence, they no longer questioned it. The act was as natural to them as breathing. Yet among the elders, there was always a subtle awareness that the world beyond their border shifted and churned. They spoke of it rarely, but the knowledge was there in the pauses of conversation, in the way eyes sometimes drifted toward the tree line, as though expecting something to arrive. Whatever bound them here was not simply tradition, it was vigilance, the quiet certainty that if they did not maintain their ways, something essential would unravel. This was the unspoken truth of Deadwater. To be born here was to inherit a duty, one that demanded both loyalty and silence, and to break either was to invite a fate no one dared describe aloud. The winter that followed was unlike any Deadwater had known in living memory. It was not merely cold, it was an unyielding siege that locked the land in silence. The ground froze hard enough to split stone, and the skeletal birches stood rigid, their branches clicking faintly in the wind, as if whispering secrets from one to another. Snow did not drift gently, but fell in hard, heavy sheets that flattened paths and buried landmarks, leaving the three houses isolated in pale, uneven mounds. The lake was the first to surrender. Shallow and dark in the warmer months, it iced over so completely that the bottom stones were caught within the glassy prison. Even the old cistern, which for generations had endured the bitterest seasons, formed a skin of ice so perfect it reflected candlelight like a polished mirror. Each morning, before the sun had risen enough to burn away the stars, someone would take the iron rod and tap gently at the surface until it cracked open. The family treated this act with the same careful respect one might show when lifting the face of a corpse, slow, deliberate, and without shattering more than necessary. That year, a quiet rebellion began. One of the younger men, a cousin whose features bore the faintest hints of an outsider somewhere deep in the family tree, started to resist. His defiance was not loud or theatrical. It came in the smallest of gestures, the kind that could almost be missed if you weren't looking closely. At the midwinter gathering, when the bowls of water from the cistern were passed in solemn rotation, he accepted his in both hands, but did not drink. He merely touched two fingertips to the surface, held them there long enough for the chill to numb his skin, then lowered his gaze without raising the bowl to his lips. No one spoke. The air in the room thickened, as though even the fire hesitated to crackle too loudly. The eldest woman, bent-backed but with eyes that burned in their sockets like cold embers, fixed him in her gaze. She did not scold, did not even frown, but the stillness she cast over the table was suffocating. One by one, the others drank. The bowl was taken from him without comment, and the gathering continued, yet something had shifted in that room. From that night forward, he was never again asked to fetch water from the cistern. In Deadwater, tasks were more than chores, they were quiet affirmations of belonging. To be removed from one was a punishment disguised as omission. The younger children avoided his eyes, as though fearing that whatever had tainted him might pass through a glance. There were old stories about what happened to those who turned away from the customs. They were not shared openly, they were murmured in low voices, during long nights, or while cutting meat in the kitchen, when no one else could hear. Some claimed such people left willingly, disappearing into the endless forest paths, until they were swallowed by snow and distance. Others believed the land itself was a jealous keeper, that it twisted roads and turned compasses, bringing the wanderer back again and again, until they were too broken to try leaving. The cousin stayed through the rest of that winter, his movements subdued, his laughter gone. He no longer sat close to the fire during the gatherings, instead taking the far corner of the room where shadows clung thickest. There were moments when his gaze seemed fixed on something no one else could see, something moving beyond the frost-laced windows. When spring came, and the ice finally surrendered to running water, he was simply gone. His bed remained made, his boots lined neatly against the wall. There were no footprints in the thawing mud, no signs of a struggle, no farewell note. The family did not form a search party, nor did they speak his name in the daylight. It was only in the depths of the next winter that his name was recited again, woven into the cadence of the absent. It was not a commemoration, it was a reminder, spoken with the same weight as a curse, ensuring no one forgot what happened to those who strayed. And though no one said it aloud, each of them knew the truth. In Deadwater, you could turn from the ritual, but the bloodline was a tether that reached farther than any road, binding you in ways that had nothing to do with choice. Spring in Deadwater did not arrive like it did elsewhere. There was no sudden bloom of green, no chorus of returning birds. The thaw came slowly, grudgingly, as though the land itself disliked letting go of winter's grip. The snow receded in irregular patches, leaving behind slick ground that smelled faintly of decay. The lake shed its ice reluctantly, the breaking surface emitting low groans that carried across the still air. It was during this fragile season that the family undertook what they called the clearing. No outsiders had ever witnessed it, and even among the younger kin, there were rules about speaking of it aloud. The clearing began at first light. Men and women moved in silence, carrying long-handled tools whose shapes did not match anything one might see in a farmer's shed. Their purpose was not to till the soil, but to unearth what winter had buried. At the forest's edge, the snow was darker, infused with soil and something else, a faint reddish hue that lingered in the slush. Here, the elders worked most carefully, probing the softening earth with their tools before lifting out small wrapped bundles. Some were no larger than a man's hand, others were the length of a forearm. Each was covered in layers of cloth stained deep brown, bound tightly with fraying cord. None of the younger family members dared to ask what lay inside. The bundles were carried, one at a time, to a shallow pit dug behind the largest of the three houses. The pit was lined with rough stones, blackened as though scorched. One by one, the packages were lowered inside, arranged in neat, concentric circles. A pale smoke rose from the pit's edges, even before anything was set alight, as though the stones themselves exhaled at the sight of the offerings. When all the bundles had been placed, the eldest woman stepped forward, holding a small clay jar. The contents were thick and dark, and when she poured it over the pit, the air filled with a scent that was neither sweet nor foul, but heavy, clinging to the nostrils, settling into the lungs. Only then did the fire begin, not from a match or flint, but from a smouldering ember, carried in a metal dish from the house's hearth. The flames did not roar, they crept slow and deliberate, consuming the cloth and whatever lay within without sending up sparks. No one turned away as the smoke thickened. The youngest children were held firmly by the hand, forced to watch until the last wisp of white cloth curled inward and disappeared. The pit was then covered with a wooden lid, weighted down by stones. The ashes were never removed. After the clearing, the family washed their hands in the cistern water, the cold biting at their skin. The water darkened slightly with each rinse, as though absorbing what they had touched. By nightfall, the family returned to their routines as if nothing had happened. No one mentioned the bundles. No one asked how many had been retrieved this year, compared to the last. But in the stillness that followed, there was a shift in the house. The air felt cleaner, lighter, though not in a way that brought comfort. It was as though something that had been watching them through the winter had finally turned its gaze elsewhere, for now. By the time the clearing ended, the land around Deadwater had fallen into a hush, so complete, it was as if the world itself was holding its breath. The thawed patches of earth steamed faintly under the weak sun, giving the impression that the ground was still alive, sighing out whatever it had been forced to keep through the frozen months. The family, stripped of the ceremonial rhythm that had occupied their day, moved back into the house with a kind of slow reluctance. Inside, the air was thick with the mingled scents of damp wool, wood smoke, and whatever residue the clearing had left clinging to their clothes. No one removed their coats. They simply took seats at the long table, their chairs creaking under the weight of bodies suddenly aware of their own tiredness. The elder woman, the same who had poured the dark liquid over the pit, began ladling out a thin broth from a pot that had simmered all day. The broth was served without bread, without anything to break its plainness. Each family member ate in silence, the scrape of spoons against wooden bowls the only sound. No blessing was spoken, no word of thanks offered. In Deadwater, meals after the clearing were never for comfort. They were simply a way to restore the strength needed to keep going. It was then between spoonfuls that the eldest man spoke, not to the group, but to the space just beyond the far end of the table. His voice was low, nearly inaudible, yet it carried clearly in the still room. The younger ones froze, their spoons suspended mid-air. His words were not in English. They rolled out in a harsh, almost guttural cadence, like a language shaped in the back of the throat. The elder woman responded in kind, her tone sharper, clipped, as though cutting into whatever unseen presence had been addressed. For a moment the air seemed to tighten, the shadows along the walls shifting subtly, as if the firelight had been disturbed. The man gave a final reply, short and final, and then returned to his bowl, as though nothing had occurred. The younger ones followed suit, but not without glancing toward the darkened end of the table, where no chair sat. When the bowls were emptied, the family dispersed without instruction. Some went to the back rooms, others to the loft above the kitchen. The elder woman remained at the table, fingers resting lightly on the wood, as though listening for something beneath it. Eventually, she too rose, moving toward the large cabinet in the corner. The cabinet's doors were carved with intricate patterns, loops, circles, and interlocking shapes that seemed to blur if stared at too long. She unlocked it with a key worn to the color of old bone. Inside, the shelves were lined with objects wrapped in oiled cloth. She selected one at random, unwrapped it halfway, and studied its contents in the flickering firelight. Whatever it was, it glinted, faintly metallic, faintly wet, before she sealed it again and returned it to its place. Upstairs, the younger members lay in their narrow beds, eyes wide open. They had learned early that nights after the clearing were restless ones. The sound of shifting footsteps sometimes rose from the frozen yard, too light to belong to the living, too deliberate to be the wind. And from somewhere far beyond the lake, faint enough to be mistaken for the groan of the ice, came a sound like a slow, steady breathing, not in the air, but in the earth itself. Morning in Deadwater did not arrive with sunlight, but with a dim greyness that seeped reluctantly into the sky. The lake outside the house was still shrouded in mist, curling low over the frozen surface like breath held too long. Inside, the family stirred in near silence. There was no chatter, no routine clatter of dishes, only the dull thump of boots on the floorboards and the faint hiss of the stove being fed. The elder woman was already seated at the long table, a ledger spread open before her. Its pages were thick, uneven, and stained. The ink faded to the color of dried blood. She did not write in it daily. Entries were made only after nights when the clearing had been used. This morning, her hand moved slowly, shaping the same alien script that had been spoken the evening before. From the loft above, one of the younger men descended carrying a small bundle wrapped in black cloth. He placed it on the table without a word, and the elder woman paused to unwrap it. Inside lay a length of coarse rope, stiffened and darkened in patches. Her gaze lingered on it for a long moment before she began recording something beside the script, a set of careful measurements, noted with almost ritualistic precision. The rope was then rewrapped and returned to a locked chest in the corner. The younger man left the room without looking back, but his footsteps faltered briefly as he passed the cabinet with its strange carved doors. It was as if he could feel a faint pulse emanating from it, a slow and steady rhythm that did not belong to anything human. Outside, the mist had thickened rather than lifted. Figures moved faintly within it, shapes that looked like people but never came close enough to reveal their faces. The family paid them no attention, or at least pretended not to. In Deadwater, looking too long at what moved in the mist was considered an invitation, and invitations here were rarely declined. The elder woman finished her writing, closed the ledger, and pressed her palm flat against its cover. The air in the room cooled noticeably, as though a draught had slipped in through unseen cracks. Somewhere in the walls, the faint sound of shifting wood echoed, not like settling, but like something moving deliberately within. She did not rise immediately. Instead, she remained at the table, her eyes fixed on the rope's chest as though she could still see through the wood. It was not an object that left the house often, but when it did, the lake's mist seemed to reach further inland, curling into the trees and clinging to the earth long after it should have faded. Above her, the sound of the younger members' footsteps resumed, heavier now, more purposeful. They were preparing for something, though the day's true purpose would remain unspoken until the moment came, and when it did, the lake would not be the only thing breathing beneath the fog. The night after the rope was returned to the locked chest, the mist rolled back into Deadwater, even thicker than before, swallowing the line of trees at the property's edge, until they seemed to dissolve into the air itself. The lake's surface was invisible, but its presence was felt in the dampness that clung to every wall, every window pane, every scrap of fabric inside the house. By dusk, the air was so heavy with moisture that breathing felt like pulling it through cloth. The family gathered in the main room without being called. It was the kind of summons that didn't require words. They had all felt the same shift in the air, the same prickling pressure along the back of the neck that signaled the beginning of one of those nights. The elder woman sat in her chair, the ledger open again, though this time no ink met the page. She simply traced the edge of the paper with one fingertip, her eyes half closed as though listening for something distant. A low creak came from the ceiling beams above, and every head turned slightly toward the sound. There was no one upstairs, not anymore. The loft had been empty for weeks, yet at night the boards groaned as if bearing weight. The younger members exchanged brief glances but said nothing. They had learned long ago that certain noises in Deadwater were not to be acknowledged. To speak of them was to invite them closer. At the far end of the room, the cabinet with the carved doors stood like a sentinel, its dark wood absorbing the lamplight. The carvings were shallow but intricate, a lattice of interwoven shapes that seemed to shift subtly when viewed from different angles. In the lamplight, the patterns resembled twisted branches or tangled veins, and if one stared too long, the spaces between them seemed to deepen, as though the wood opened into something much darker than air. One of the middle-aged men, gaunt-faced, his skin ashen from years of the lake's damp cold, crossed the room to kneel before the cabinet. He placed both hands flat against its surface, then leaned in until his forehead touched the wood. His lips moved, whispering something too softly for the others to hear. The elder woman did not look up, but her hand stopped tracing the ledger's edge. Outside, faint footsteps crunched over the frost-hardened ground. They circled the house once, then again, closer this time. No shadow passed the windows. The sound came from something walking just beyond the thin reach of the lamplight. When the steps stopped, the man at the cabinet pulled back, exhaling in a slow shudder. He turned to the elder woman and gave a single nod. The room shifted subtly in response. The younger members rose, each moving with a deliberate, unhurried calm toward the door that led out to the clearing. Their movements mirrored one another, each step a careful echo of the one before, as though they were following a dance they had rehearsed countless times. The door was opened only wide enough to let them slip through one by one. Outside, the mist swallowed their shapes within moments, leaving only the faint scuff of boots and the occasional soft clink of something metallic. Inside, the elder woman finally dipped her pen into the inkwell. She began to write in the ledger again, this time in long continuous strokes that seemed to flow without pause, the strange script wrapping around itself like a coiled root. Between certain symbols, she paused to draw tiny deliberate marks, cross-hatches and loops that did not match the main language, but seemed to be annotations of some kind. From somewhere deep in the mist, a sound rose, low at first, almost like wind through hollow wood, then swelling into something less natural. It was not a scream, but it was close enough to one that the ear resisted telling the difference. The elder woman did not flinch, her pen did not waver. Minutes passed before the sound faded. The younger members returned one by one, their boots leaving damp prints across the floor. None of them looked directly at the elder woman, but each brushed a hand lightly against the table as they passed, as if marking their return. The last to enter carried something under his coat. He crossed the room without hesitation, and placed it on the table beside the ledger. It was a bundle, smaller than the rope from the previous night, but wrapped in the same black cloth. This time, however, the fabric was soaked through in places, the dampness seeping into the wood beneath. The elder woman stared at it for a long moment before setting her pen aside. She reached out and unfolded the cloth with slow, precise movements. Inside lay a small wooden box, crudely made but sealed with something that had darkened and cracked with age. A faint metallic smell escaped as the cloth fell away, curling into the air like the ghost of a long-buried fire. Her eyes narrowed, and the corners of her mouth tightened, not in fear, but in recognition. She closed the ledger, drew the bundle closer, and whispered something so faint it might have been mistaken for breath. The lamplight flickered, and the mist outside pressed harder against the windows, as if it had been listening all along. The wooden box remained on the table long after the others had drifted away into the deeper rooms of the house. The elder woman sat alone beside it, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the grain of the wood, as though she were reading something written beneath its surface. The lamplight trembled in the stale air, each flicker throwing her face into sharp relief. Cheekbones like ridges of stone, mouth set in a line that had not shifted in decades. She did not open the box immediately. In Deadwater, certain things could only be done when the house itself was ready. The silence was not empty here. It was full, dense with the weight of things unsaid, and she knew better than to move against it. Somewhere above her, a single drop of water fell from the ceiling into a metal basin with a hollow ring. The sound did not repeat. She tilted her head slightly, listening for more, but the house gave her nothing. Her attention returned to the box. Its surface was uneven, the wood swollen in places where damp had long ago seeped into it. At each corner, a nail head glimmered faintly in the lamplight, darkened by age but still holding firm. Across the lid, faint scratches ran in different directions, some deep enough to catch a fingernail. They were not random. There was a pattern, crude but deliberate, almost as if someone had been trying to write without knowing the letters. She ran one fingertip across the marks. The wood felt warm, though no heat came from the stove. A faint pulse seemed to move beneath it, slow and steady, as though the box were breathing. She withdrew her hand quickly, curling her fingers into her palm. From the far side of the room came the sound of a door opening, followed by slow, measured footsteps. One of the middle-aged women entered, her hair loose, her eyes shadowed. She did not look directly at the elder, but instead at the box, her gaze locked on it, as she moved to stand at the opposite side of the table. "It's time," she said softly, though the words were not quite a statement. They were an echo, something the elder had heard many times before. The elder nodded once. She reached for a small key hanging from a cord around her neck and slid it into the box's lock. The mechanism resisted, stiff with rust, but yielded with a dull click. A faint metallic scent deepened in the air. The lid rose slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside was a bundle wrapped in coarse, yellowed cloth. The elder pulled it free and laid it on the table. The cloth was stiff in places, and as she unwrapped it, a pale object emerged. A carved figure, no larger than a child's forearm, fashioned from something that was not quite wood, not quite bone. Its surface was smooth in some areas, ridged in others, as if the material itself had resisted the shaping. The figure had no face, only a deep hollow where the features should have been. Thin grooves spiraled down its body, intersecting in strange patterns that drew the eye in unsettling ways. The middle-aged woman took a step back, her hands tightening at her sides. The elder did not flinch. She set the figure upright, and the moment it touched the wood of the table, the lamplight dimmed as though something in the room had swallowed it. From the walls came a faint, irregular tapping, like the sound of small things moving inside the wood. The elder leaned forward and whispered to the figure in a language that had not been spoken outside these walls for more than a century. Her voice was low, her words curling into the air like smoke, each syllable lingering longer than it should. The mist at the window thickened, pressing so close that it obscured the glass entirely. A soft rhythmic knock came from somewhere beyond it. 3 times, then silence, then 3 times again. Neither woman turned toward the sound. The elder finished her whispering and lowered her hands to the table. The figure seemed to tilt slightly, though no one had touched it. The grooves along its surface shimmered faintly, as if wet. The tapping in the walls stopped all at once, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from beneath the floorboards. Without a word, the elder rewrapped the figure in its cloth, placed it back into the box, and closed the lid. The key turned smoothly this time, as though the lock had been oiled from within. When she finally looked at the other woman, her eyes were sharper, clearer, but colder. "It will be soon," she said. The woman nodded, and left the room without another word. The elder remained seated in the fading lamplight, one hand resting lightly on the box, as if to keep it from listening too closely to the thoughts she had not yet spoken. The house seemed to exhale, once the middle-aged woman's footsteps faded into silence. It was a long, slow release, the sort of stillness that comes after a room has been emptied of all but one breathing thing. Yet the elder knew she was not alone, not entirely. Something had shifted in the air when the figure had been unwrapped, and the residue of that presence clung stubbornly to the walls. She rose from the table with deliberate slowness, her hand still resting on the closed box, until the last possible moment. The wood seemed reluctant to let her go, as though it had taken on the memory of her palm. She crossed the room toward the cabinet, her steps making no sound on the worn boards, and slid open its carved doors. Inside, among the layered relics of Deadwater's history, was a space she had cleared years ago for objects that could not be left among the others. She set the box inside, careful not to disturb the things that flanked it. A jar sealed with wax so old it had cracked into fine lines, and a rolled length of parchment bound with a strip of leather that looked far too fresh for its age. Once the box was in place, she closed the doors and drew the latch. The wind outside picked up, dragging the mist against the windows in soft, uneven swirls. It sounded almost like breath, ragged and uncertain, as though the night itself were pressing its face to the glass. The elder turned toward the window but did not approach. She knew better than to give the outside a clear view of her. From deeper in the house came the creak of a bed frame under shifting weight, followed by the low murmur of voices. They were speaking in the same old tongue she had used with the figure, the words muffled but steady. She could not catch the meaning, but the rhythm of the exchange told her it was not a conversation but a recitation, a passing of lines from one mouth to another like the steps of an unbroken ritual. She left the main room and moved down the hall toward the sound. The narrow corridor was lined with frames, each holding photographs that had faded almost to nothing, faces blurred into pale ovals, and clothing dissolved into shades of grey. Some frames were empty entirely, though their glass remained intact, reflecting the lamplight, like watching eyes. At the end of the hall, the door to the back room stood slightly ajar. She pushed it open and stepped inside. 4 of the family members sat in a square around the bed, their hands resting on their knees, their eyes fixed on the figure lying in the center of the mattress. It was a boy, no more than 12, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow but even. A black cord circled his wrist, the ends trailing off the bed and onto the floor where they disappeared under a small rug. The elder knew without lifting it what was beneath, a knotwork pattern woven into the boards themselves, blackened with age, meant to hold whatever was tied to it. The voices paused as she entered, then resumed without acknowledging her. She moved to stand at the boy's side, studying the faint sheen of sweat across his brow. His lips moved slightly, forming sounds too soft to be heard, though they carried the same cadence as the murmured recitation. The elder reached into her pocket and withdrew a strip of cloth, the color of dried blood. She folded it once, then twice, until it was a narrow band, and tied it carefully across the boy's eyes. His murmuring stopped instantly, replaced by a long, steady inhale, as if the act had released him from something. She stepped back. "He's ready," she said quietly. The 4 adults rose in unison. They untied the cord from the boy's wrist, pulling it free from beneath the rug, and wound it into a coil. The elder took the coil, feeling the residual warmth in the fibers. Without another word, they filed out of the room, leaving the boy still and blindfolded on the bed. The elder led them back to the main room, where the cabinet loomed in its shadowed corner. She set the cord on the table, its black strands pooling like a shadow made solid. One of the men leaned forward, his voice low. "It will call tonight." The elder met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Then we will answer." Outside, the wind's rhythm changed, shifting into a slow, deliberate beat. It struck the walls like the echo of a hand against a drum, steady and patient. The mist thickened once more, curling around the house, pressing against the cracks as though seeking entry. The elder rested her hand on the cord, her fingers curling around it with a kind of grim familiarity. She could feel the pulse again, not in the fibers this time, but in the space between each beat of the wind outside. It would come, and they would be ready. The night had settled into that peculiar stillness, where every sound seemed deliberate, placed with intent by something unseen. The family gathered in the main room, not in the haphazard way of people drawn by conversation, but in a precise formation that had been repeated so many times, it was second nature. The elder sat at the head of the long table, the cord coiled neatly in front of her, the box locked away, but heavy in everyone's mind. No one spoke. The only light came from 2 oil lamps, their flames held low so the shadows rose tall and fluid along the walls. Outside, the mist pressed harder against the glass, curling in tendrils across the panes like searching fingers. The wind, which had been restless earlier, had stilled into a measured, almost human cadence, as though something vast was pacing in circles just beyond sight. The elder's gaze moved slowly from one face to another, the 2 men with the weathered skin of those who had lived all their lives in shadowed rooms, the 3 women whose expressions held the same unreadable stillness, and the thin girl with hair that hung like wet strands of straw over her shoulders. She was the youngest present, her eyes lowered, her hands resting flat on the table, as though holding something down that no one else could see. The elder's voice, when it came, was barely louder than the lamp's hiss. "When it calls, none of you will answer, unless I speak first." Her eyes fixed on the girl, whose lips parted as though she might object. The elder's stare deepened, and the girl closed her mouth without a word. Somewhere deep beneath the house, a sound began, faint at first, like the slow stretch of rope under weight. It came again, longer this time, rising into a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. The girl's fingers twitched against the wood, but she kept them pressed flat. The elder reached into her lap and brought out a small, shallow bowl carved from something bone-pale and faintly porous. Into it she poured a thin stream of liquid from a dark bottle, the scent sharp and metallic, cutting through the air like a blade. The hum beneath the house shifted, quickening, as if the sound could taste what she was doing. Without looking up, the elder began to coil the black cord into the liquid, letting it soak until the strands darkened further, swallowing the lamplight. She lifted it carefully, droplets running down her wrists, and set it in the center of the table. The pacing outside stopped. The mist froze against the glass, solid as frost. Then came the first knock, slow, deliberate, somewhere between a hand against wood and the uneven pulse of a heart. The youngest woman on the left shivered, her breath fogging in the suddenly cold air. The elder looked toward the door, but made no move to rise. The knock came again, louder this time, and the hum under the floor rose in answer. From the far corner, one of the men spoke in the old language, the words sharp and clipped, their meaning older than the walls themselves. The elder lifted a hand, silencing him. A third knock came, followed by a pause so long it seemed the night itself had stopped breathing. Then from beyond the misted window, a voice spoke, low, unhurried, every syllable sinking into the room like drops of dark water. It did not speak in English, nor in the family's old tongue, yet every person at the table understood the meaning. It was calling for the boy. The girl's head snapped up, her eyes wide now, reflecting the lamplight. "It's not supposed to know his name," she whispered, her voice trembling in the heavy air. The elder did not look at her. She rose slowly from her chair, the cord dangling from her hand, its soaked strands trailing dark marks across the floor. The knocking ceased. The mist at the window began to drift upward, revealing only darkness beyond. She stopped at the center of the room, the others watching with the stillness of statues. "We will not open the door," she said. "It has been here before, and it will be here again. But tonight it waits in the wrong shape." From beneath the floor came a sharp crack, like wood splintering under enormous weight. The hum broke apart into a dozen smaller sounds, each one moving quickly along the walls, the ceiling, the very air. The elder wound the cord around her wrist, once, twice, 3 times, and began to speak to the dark beyond the windows. Her voice was steady, her words falling in a rhythm, meant to bind rather than invite. The air in the room thickened, pressing against the lungs of those who listened, as if the house itself was holding its breath. When she finished, the mist outside pulled back all at once, retreating into the trees until the windows stood bare against the black. The knocking did not return. The hum faded, but the elder kept the cord wound tight around her wrist. The night was far from done. The elder did not return to her seat. She stood at the head of the table with the soaked cord wrapped tight around her wrist, her eyes fixed on the bare black beyond the glass. The others waited in silence, but there was a tension in the room that no one could name. It wasn't the silence of relief. It was the kind that arrives when something has gone quiet too soon. The girl was the first to move. She pushed back her chair, the legs scraping lightly against the floor, and stepped toward the hall that led to the back rooms. The elder's voice cut through the dim air, without rising. "Do not go to him." The girl froze, her back rigid, her head tilted slightly, as though she was listening to something no one else could hear. "He's awake," she whispered. "He's calling for." She stopped, her lips sealing abruptly as though a hand had been clamped over her mouth. She turned her head slowly toward the elder, her expression empty now, eyes unblinking. The elder loosened the cord from her wrist and let it hang between her hands. "Bring him here," she said to the 2 men seated at the far end of the table. They rose without question and moved down the hall, their steps synchronized, their shadows swaying against the walls. When they returned, the boy was between them. His bare feet left faint damp marks on the floor. Though the boards had been dry, his skin had taken on a pallid sheen, and his eyes, though open, seemed fixed on something far above the room. The elder motioned to the chair at the opposite end of the table, and the men placed him there. The black cord trailed across the wood toward him, and without prompting, he reached out and took it in both hands. Outside, the wind began again, slow and deliberate, pressing the last wisps of mist against the glass. The boy's lips moved, but no sound came. The elder stepped closer, leaning over him, and for the first time that night, her voice took on a note of urgency. "Do not let it speak through you," she said. "Not here." The boy's fingers tightened on the cord. His head jerked once, violently, as though something had pulled at the back of his skull. Then a voice emerged, not his own, and not the one they had heard beyond the door earlier. This one was thinner, older, its words strained as though traveling a great distance. It spoke in fragments, a place, a name, a warning that came too quickly to be understood. The elder's hand came down sharply over the cord, and the boy's mouth snapped shut. The voice cut off mid-syllable, leaving only the sound of his shallow breathing. The girl stepped forward now, her earlier stillness replaced with a strange clarity in her expression. "It isn't here for him," she said. "It's here for the thing you put in the cabinet." The elder's eyes shifted toward the shadowed corner, where the locked doors hid their burden. Her mouth tightened. "It cannot take what it cannot enter," she said. But there was something in her tone that betrayed the faintest trace of doubt. From somewhere deep beneath the floor, the hum returned, this time sharper, more insistent. It rose quickly, rattling the lamp glass, shivering along the wood grain of the table. The elder unwound the cord from the boy's hands and coiled it once more, holding it close to her chest. "We end it here," she said, "before it remembers how to come in." The family moved without instruction, closing the shutters, pushing furniture against the doors, sealing the seams of the windows with lengths of dark cloth that seemed ready for this purpose. The girl stood at the center of the room, her head tilted slightly, eyes half closed, as though listening to the exact path the sound took through the bones of the house. The hum faltered, dropped, and then stopped entirely. For a breathless span of moments, the silence was total. Then, with no warning, every lamp in the room flared, not with fire, but with a cold white light that cast no shadow. The elder's voice rose sharply, not in fear, but in command. She spoke in the old language, each word heavy enough to make the air tremble. The light dimmed, faded, and the oil flames returned. The hum did not resume. The boy slumped forward, his forehead resting on the table, the cord slipping from his fingers. The elder gathered it, her face unreadable. "It will not return tonight," she said. But this is not finished. Outside the mist had gone, leaving only the dark outline of the trees against the moonless sky. Yet in the space between each branch, the black seemed too deep, too complete, as if something waited there still, patient and unseen. By dawn, the air around the house had cleared, but no one inside spoke of what had come to their door. The boy slept in the corner, his breathing slow and even, as though the night's intrusion had never touched him. Yet every now and then, his fingers twitched, curling faintly, as if still gripping the cord in some hidden dream. The elder moved quietly from room to room, checking the shutters, touching the frames of the doors, as if to feel for any trace of heat or breath. She said nothing of the voice that had called through the mist, nor of the shape it claimed to take. Some things in her mind were weakened the moment they were named aloud. In the small hours, the girl awoke and found the elder sitting at the table, the cord coiled before her like a patient serpent. Outside, the first pale light was filtering through the trees, but the shadows it cast were longer than they should have been, reaching toward the house. The elder did not look up as the girl entered. "It will come again," she said quietly, "and next time it may not knock."